My life has changed. My life has changed many, many times. But this book has not. It's only changed once. The title that I'm holding right now has not changed at all, so it's perfect. But this title that I'm reading, it gets better. It stays the same and it gets better. The reason Uriel is my hero, even to the point where if I met someone named Uriel in real life, I'm excited to meet them. That's how cool I think Uriel Ventress is. And the reason he's a cool hero is he believes in the truth. And he knows that even though he's fucking alone, and even though he has to prove everything to everyone, he knows he can move forward as long as he moves towards the truth. Black shapes against the sky screeched as they ascended from the heights of the mountains and streaked towards the two space marines. The delirium specters filled the air with wails of murder victims, and Uriel could hear their agony in every shriek torn from their bodies. He scanned the plateau for obvious hiding places, hating the idea of flight, but knowing that the Amphilos Demonomium, the Omphalos Demonomium, had just not lied to him when it had told them that it would be not wise to be found by these creatures. "Uriel!" said Pausanias, pointing further up the steep slopes of the mountain to a narrow defile in the rock face. "There! I don't think they'll be able to get in there." "Can we make it?" "Only one way to find out," said Pausanias, setting off for the scree slope. Uriel buckled on his sword and ran after Pausanias. His ragged and strained breath. His back felt as if it was on fire, but he pushed aside the pain as he reached the slope and began climbing after Pausanias. The slope was rough, composed of dusty iron filings, craggy lumps of coal, and twisted scoria. Pausanias' prodigious strength enabled him to scale the slope, albeit with great difficulty. But the loose incline gave Uriel no purchase, and the harder he struggled, the further he slid back. He rolled to the left as a creature dropped from the sky, wielding iron claws on its wings, gouging the ground where his head had been. He kicked out and the creature skidded down the slope, its fleshy wings beating in the air, in fury as it righted itself. His shape was like that of some great ocean-dwelling manta, an external skeleton formed of iron struts, its flesh a bellowing sheet of patchwork human skin stitched into the metal. Screaming faces bulged across its leathery hive, a vicious O of a mouth, edged in hundreds of needle-like teeth. Other creatures swooped from above, their jaws stretching across the entire surface of their skin, and billowing wings flaring out to arrest their dives as they smashed into Uriel. The creature Uriel had knocked aside leapt in the air with a discordant howl as he struggled with the beast that enfolded him, their teeth gnashing against his armor. Pausanias shot the airborne delirium spectre, but his bolt passed clean through its flesh before detonating. Uriel gripped the greasy flesh of the Okay, they fought the things. And I guess the funnest detail was he gripped the flapping skin to either side and tore it from the iron frame, feeling the souls trapped within scream of their release. Flickering lights and joyous cries erupted from the dying beast, and as the last soul departed, Uriel was left with an inanimate pile of torn flesh and metal in his hands. He hurled its remains aside, as yet more of these creatures encircled lower. Uriel drew his sword, slashing the energized blade through the flesh of the nearest delirium spectre, drawing a hysterical shriek of freedom from its jaws before it collapsed. The last beast leapt toward him, and he dived forwards, rolling and slashing with his blade and hacking it into two halves as it passed overhead. He heard another cry of release, and saw a lifeless pile of iron struts and burning skin lying further on the slope. Pausanias had his flamer out, spraying burning gouts of promethium in the air to discourage the other creatures from approaching too closely. "Come on!" shouted Pausanias. "I don't know how much longer this will hold them." Uriel sheathed his sword and stopped to grab two short lengths of iron from the corpse of the nearest monster, before heading once more for the treacherous slope. Driving the lengths of iron bar deep into the powdery shale like crude pitons, Uriel was able to climb the slope without too much difficulty, while Pausanias kept the delirium specters at bay with his flamer. At last he reached the ledge, and rolled onto his back as the delirium specters closed in again. He drew his sword once more and slashed at the first. The two space marines edged backwards to the sanctuary of the defile, killing the shrieking, swooping beasts every time they came near. The defile was behind them, and Uriel glanced along its length. As it wound further and deeper into the mountain, flocks of the delirium specters circled lower, and Uriel prayed they would not be able to follow him. "I can't tell where it leads," he said. "It doesn't matter now, does it?" replied Pausanias, bleeding from a patchwork of shallow cuts across the side of his head. "We don't have much choice." "Give them one more blast and follow me in." Pausanias nodded and shouted, "Go!" and sent another stream of blazing liquid toward the shrieking monsters. Uriel darted toward the defile, the narrow basalt walls glassy, black, and reflected. It scraped against his iron guards, his shouldered guards, cutting grooves through the paint, and Uriel offered a whispered prayer of forgiveness to the armor's battle spirit at such careless treatment. Pausanias backed to the narrow defile, having to force his way sidelong through the narrow length, and Uriel had a sickened vision of the pair of them, trapped here and waiting to be picked off by these vile creatures. I did skip a fair amount of exposition, but the ending of the story is good, the exposition's not great. The mini stories is the other way around. You're going to get some incredible exposition, right? And then the ending's just like, wow. I wish it... Yeah. But ultimately, I would encourage you, instead of seeing this as one comprehensive story, just see it as a version of hell, a true vision of hell. Dante's Inferno. And I wouldn't even say updated, because hell doesn't go through phases or anything. It's just hell. There's no time in hell, and I think that would be the worst. I think when they say you go to hell for 1,000,000 years, what they really mean is there's no time. You wouldn't know the difference. It's difficult to describe how much our race, the human race, relies on clocks. The other beasts of this planet do not, and yet they seem to be fine. "Damn, but it's tight," grunted Pausanias stoically. Frustrated screeches rang from above, and Uriel saw scores of the monstrous beasts flashing overhead, across the narrow strip of sky at the top of the defile. He pushed further along its twisting length, the ground sloping upwards, and the distance between them and this open sky diminishing with every step. "We're running out of room!" he cried back, as a desperate scrabble of claws and clanging of metal and stone sounded from above. Hissing beasts, fleshy wings thrashing, forcing themselves down into the defile, their screeches echoing deafeningly in the enclosed space. Wails of frantic hunger and longing spat from their bodies, and Uriel stabbed upwards, skewering the first of the delirium specters on his blade. More forced themselves into the defile, clanging and beating against one another as they struggled to reach their prey. Unable to fire his flamer in such a tight space, Pausanias ripped them apart with his bare hands, tearing the skin from the desecrated frames with angry bellows. Uriel stabbed and cut blindly, dead flesh enfolding him, and sharp teeth snapping at his face. The sound of tearing skin mingled with their grunts of pain and the incongruous noise of joyful souls escaping their hideous torment as each beast died. "Keep going!" shouted Pausanias in a lull between the ferocious attacks. "I don't know what's ahead," answered Uriel. "It can't be any worse than this." Uriel couldn't disagree and forged onwards, wiping clotted blood from his forehead and desperately seeking somewhere that would offer better shelter. The delirium specters resumed their circling above, patiently waiting for another chance to attack. The defile twisted and turned, each step winding further into the mountain, until at last it turned downward and led into a narrow path that ran along the side of a sheer cliff. The rock face fell away for hundreds of meters on one side of the path, and at its end, Uriel could see a narrow cave, its entrance surrounded with a forest of long iron spikes, hammered into the rock. "There's a cave ahead," said Uriel. "Looks like someone has used it to hide from these things already." "How can you tell?" "There are spikes around the cave mouth. I doubt these beasts could get near the entrance without fouling their wings." "That just begs the question, who put them there?" finished Uriel. Pausanias looked towards the sky, hearing the delirium specters playing from the rock, and their shrill cries drawing closer as they circled down to attack once more. "We will have to make a break for it," said Uriel. "We'll never make it," pointed out Pausanias. "They'd be on us before we got halfway." "You think I don't know that?" snapped Uriel. "But we have to try." Uriel bit his lip as he wondered how far they could get before the creatures caught them. They might be able to fight some off, but not all of them. And even if the monsters didn't kill them, it would only be too easy for them to hurl them to the path. And to fall such a distance would be fatal, even to one as mighty as a space marine. One of the monsters flew overhead, its blind hunger loathsome and utterly alien. "Wait," said Uriel, as a memory struggled to the surface of his mind. "What?" "When the demon spoke of these creatures, it said something about how they hunted, something about our hearts, and how we wouldn't go unnoticed for long. And that's how they're hunting us. They can hear our heartbeats," said Uriel. Pausanias wasn't silent for a long moment, before saying, "Then we will take away what they need to hunt us. You remember the mantras that trigger the Susan membrane? Aye, it's been decades since I've needed to recite them." "I know, but damn, we better get them right," said Uriel. "I don't want to fall into a coma halfway along the path." Pausanias nodded in understanding as Uriel slowly crept to the edge of the defile. The delirium specters were high above them, still too close for them to have any hope of reaching the cave entrance unmolested. Uriel turned to Pausanias and said, "Go when I go. Slowly, not too slowly. I don't want you dying on the way." "I'll try not to." Uriel closed his eyes and recited these verses taught to him by apothecary Selenius that began the hormonal activation of the Susan membrane, an organ implanted within his brain tissue during the transformation into a space marine. He took deep breaths, regulating his breathing and forcing his heart rate to slow. What he was doing was extremely dangerous, normally requiring many hours of meditation and the correct prayers. But Uriel knew they didn't have the time for such preparations. Uriel could feel his heart pounding in his chest, their rhythm beats slowing. 40 a minute, 30. He could hear Pausanias repeating the same mantras, knowing that they had to move and reach the cave before the organ activated fully and plunged them into a state of complete suspended animation, and their hearts stopped beating completely. 3 beats a minute. Uriel stood, his vision graying at the edges, his limbs feeling like lead. He nodded to Pausanias and walked from the transient cover of the defile, moving as quickly as he dared along the path towards the cave mouth. Pausanias followed, the piercing shrieks of the demonic furies above him almost breaking his concentration, an icy sweat streaking from his pale face. Both Space Marines hugged the cliff face as they inched their way along the path. The winged beasts swooped towards them, their shrieks ringing from the cliff face as they circled and climbed in confusion, unable to pinpoint them. They were almost at the cave as flocks above wheeled aimlessly in the air. Two of the delirium specters flapped noisily past Uriel, their wings flaring as they landed with some scraping of claws on the path before him. Their cries were low and hideous as they turned slowly, their rippling fleshy skins trying to discern their quarry. Uriel slowed as he inched his way past the monsters, fighting to hold his body in the limbo between life and a self-induced coma. He stumbled, his boots scraping against the nearest beast's claws. He froze. Whatever the other senses it might have possessed, the creature did not register the touch, and ignored him. Uriel edged past the oblivious monster. The second beast took to the air as he drew near the end of the path, and the delirium specter twisted in midair, giving voice to an ear-splittering shriek as it heard the thundering beat of his heart. The flocks above ceased their confused wheeling and turned on one, screeching in triumph. "Move!" shouted Uriel, abandoning all subterfuge and running for the cave mouth, ducking below the first spike, and threading his way between the others to reach the entrance. He staggered inside, gasping a great lungful of air. His chest was a raging inferno as his heart suddenly leapt from a virtual standstill to their normal rhythm in a matter of seconds. He pushed into the Stygian darkness of the cave, dropping to his knees as he fought to stabilize his internal organs and willed himself not to slip into a sleep he knew he would not wake up from. What happened was he kicked one. He was too clumsy because his hearts were shutting down that he accidentally kicked one, and it freaked him out because he didn't know if the first one would notice it or not. Like, being kicked by a Space Marine's boot, I'm pretty sure would break anyone's bones. But the first one didn't even care. The second one, though, sensed him getting afraid because his heart shot up. So that's why they went. Pausanias backed in the cave, his flamer billowing into a cone of blazing steel. The delirium specters flapped noisily around the entrance to the cave, screaming in anger at being denied their prey. Several darted in to attack, only succeeding in skewering themselves on the sharp spikes protecting the entrance. Their thrashing bodies ripped apart, their torn skins and iron frames tumbling down the cliffs as they died. Uriel let out a juddering breath, knowing how close they had come to death. "Pausanias, are you all right?" he gasped. "Barely," wheezed Pausanias. "By the throne, I never want to have to do that again. I felt like I was dying." Uriel nodded, pulling himself upright, using the walls of the cave, his returning vision easily penetrating the gloom, and he saw that they were in a long, arched tunnel carved into the rock face. But by who? Or what? He could not tell. "At least we are safe for the moment," said Uriel. "Don't be too sure about that," replied Pausanias, kicking over a cracked human skull that lay on the floor. The two Space Marines made their way carefully along the tunnel, the screeching wails of the delirium specters fading the further they penetrated into the mountain. Their enhanced eyesight magnified the glow from the hissing nozzle of Pausanias' flamer, such that when they walked through the utter darkness, their steps were illuminated like glow globes. That is actually a nice touch, because Night vision isn't actually night vision. It doesn't really show you what's there. It more like enhances the light that's already there. Not that Warhammer has to be realistic, but it's a phenomena which it's pretty tactical. It's pretty tactical. Pausanias made the sign of the Aquila over his chest to ward off the evil. I suppose not. I have felt the evil as a poison in my bones. But to come so far, it is impossible, surely. If this is truly the Eye, then nothing is impossible, said Uriel. I had always believed the stories of worlds taken by demons and the ruinous powers are nothing more than dark legend, exaggerated tales to scare away the unwary into obedience. Would that they were, replied Uriel. But might as well destroying these. But as well as destroying these Dimincubula that Ligarian Tigerius saw in the vision, I believe that we have been brought to this place to test the strength of our faith as well. And we have failed already, muttered Pausanias. To truck with a demon. I know. I have put our very souls at risk, my friend, said Uriel. And for that I am sorry. But I could see no choice other than to make the demon believe we would do as it wished. Then you don't plan on getting it to its heart of blood, whatever that is? Of course not, said Uriel, appalled. Once we find it, I intend to smash the vile thing into 1,000,000 pieces. Thank the Emperor, breathed Pausanias. Uriel stopped suddenly. You thought that I would acquiesce to the desires of a demon? No, but given how we ended up here and what it threatened, breaking faith with the Codex Astartes is one thing, but trafficking with demons is quite another. We have been cast out by the chapter, banished from the Emperor's sight, and probably trapped forever in the Eye of Terror, said Pausanias. I can see why you might have thought it would be an option. Really? Demanded Uriel, angrily. Then pray explain to me. Pausanias did not meet Uriel's gaze, as he said, well, it seems likely that the Heart of Blood is some demonic artifact meant to bring ruin upon the enemy of our demon here in the Eye. So, might not we be doing the Emperor's work by stealing from its current master? Uriel shook his head. No, that way lies madness, and the first step on the road to betraying everything we stand for. By such steps are men damned, Pausanias. Each tiny heresy excused by some reasonable explanation until their souls are irrevocably blackened and shriveled, with no chapter to call their own. Some might say that our only loyalty now is to ourselves. But you and I both know that is not true. No matter what becomes of us, we will always be warriors of the Emperor in our hearts. I have told you this before, my friend. Do you still doubt your courage and honor? No, it is not that, began Pausanias. Then what? Nothing, said Pausanias eventually. You are right. And I am sorry for even thinking such things. Uriel locked his gaze with that of his friend. Do you remember the story of that ancient philosopher of Calth who spoke of a stalactite falling in a cave and asked if it would make a sound if no one was there to hear? Aye, nodded Pausanias. Never made sense to me. Nor I, at least until now, said Uriel. Though we have been exiled, we retain our honor. And though it is likely that the chapter will never hear of our deeds, we will continue to fight the enemies of the Emperor, Until our dying day, yes? Yes, agreed Pausanias, slapping his shoulder on Uriel's shoulder guard. And that's why you are captain, and I was just a sergeant. You know all the right things to say. Uriel chuckled. I don't know about that. I mean, look at us. Tens of thousands of light years away from Macrogg, and stuck in a cave in the Eye of Terror, filled with corpses, finished Pausanias. Uriel turned and saw that Pausanias was right. The tunnel had widened into a domed cave, with rough walls and a number of shadowy passageways leading away. The remains of a long-dead fire filled a deep fire pit in the center of the cave, a thin shaft of weak light spearing down from a smoke vent in the roof. Skeletal bodies littered the floor of the cave, splayed and broken, scattered throughout the cave, the bones dusty and cracked. Throne! What happened? Looks like they were attacked when they cooked a meal, said Pausanias, poking around the remains of a fire with a silver arm. There are pots still in the fire pit. Uriel nodded, examining the bones before him, wondering who they had belonged to. What malicious twist of fate had seen him condemned to such a death? Whoever did this was incredibly strong. Their bones are snapped clearly. Aye, and this one has had its skull ripped from its shoulders. Iron warriors? Asked Uriel. No, I don't think so, said Pausanias. There was a madness to this attack. Look at the stains on the walls. It's blood. Arterial spray. Whoever killed these people did it in a frenzy, ripping out throats and tearing their victims apart in seconds. They didn't even have time to arm themselves. Uriel crossed the chamber to join Pausanias, stepping over the bones of the dead as he noticed something metallic lying partially buried in the dust. He bent down to retrieve it, his fingers closing on a crude, thick-handled knife, its blade long and flexible. He turned to look at the splayed bodies, and a sickening realization came to him. They were skinned, he said. What? The bodies. They were skinned. They were killed, and the killers flayed them. Pausanias cursed. Is there no end to this world's evil? Uriel snapped the blade of the skinning knife and hurled it away from him, the broken pieces clattering from the rocky walls of the cave. What manner of beast would track its prey deep into the mountains to attack with such speed and frenzy before taking the time to remove its victims' hides? He hoped that they would not find out, but a sinking feeling in his gut told him that there was a good chance they had already stumbled into its territory. There's nothing we can do for them now, whoever they were. No. So, which way onwards? Uriel crossed the cave, stopping to examine each passageway, and hoping to discern some clues as to which direction offered the most hope of a way out. There are tracks leading away at this one, he said, kneeling and examining the ground in the middle passage. A lot of them. Pausanias joined him, tracing the outline of a huge footprint in the dust. There was no telling how old it was, but despite its size, there was no doubt that it was human. Are you thinking these might lead to the monster's lair, and that we should avoid it? No. I think they might lead to a way out of these tunnels. I knew you were going to say that. Uriel and Pausanias set off down the tunnel, its course meandering through the mountains for what felt like many kilometers, until they completely lost track of which way they were headed. As the ground underfoot became rockier, the tracks vanished, and Uriel knew they were hopelessly lost. But just as he began to think that they might never see the surface, he caught a hint of something in the air. A breath of motion, the faintest gust of a breeze on his skin. He held up his hand and quieted Pausanias, as he opened his mouth to speak. Just on the threshold of audibility, he could hear a soft rumble, like the distant crackle of a white noise. Though it took all of his concentration, he followed a twisting path through the tunnels, doubling back, stopping and retracing steps every now and again as he followed the noise. As it grew louder, his path became surer, and within an hour of first hearing the noise, he saw a bright sliver of light ahead. I never thought I would be grateful to see that sky again. Nor I. But it is better than the accursed darkness. Uriel nodded, and the two space marines emerged from the tunnel, blinking at the perpetual daylight of Medrengard. As they stepped out into the mountainside, Uriel saw the source of the noise he had been following. Gilliman's oath, swore Pausanias. Many kilometers ahead, over the mountains, was a fortification built from dark madness and standing in defiance of all reason. Its steepled towers and mighty bastions wounded the sky, its massive gateway a snarling void. Its walls were darkened, blood-stained stone, veined with unnatural colors that should not exist, and which burned themselves upon the retina. Lightning leapt between its towers, and the clanking of great engines and machines echoed like thunder from beyond its walls. Pillars of smoke and fire leapt from the walls, where explosions blossomed amongst them, hurling great chunks of black stone from the colossal fortress. The distant rumble of artillery crashed and boomed. Bright muzzle flares of innumerable great howitzers and siege guns firing upon the fastness from the jagged rocks below. The primal battle cries of thousands, tens of thousands of warriors, perhaps more, were carried into the wind from the distant battle, together with the smell of burnt iron and war. Clouds of ash and smoke from the blazing pyres surrounded the fortress, flickering and twitching with the fury of the siege below, and Uriel felt his soul blacken in the face of such savagery. Nothing could reach that fortress and live. But that was exactly what they had to do. So the real challenge for Uriel, because normally he would just lead a company of space marines, and they would foil some insidious scheme of some ridiculous word bearer, or just basically just like a mad scientist or something. Well, he doesn't have a company, and there is no stupid evil plan to fall apart. So it's a main character with armor, but very little plot armor. And he has nothing but faith. Pausanias as well, but I often almost see them as like the same character. They're foils of each other for sure. But I think Pausanias is just there mainly to represent everything that is wrong, like Uriel's doubts and corruption. Because Pausanias is demoralized. You will hear it in every one of his words. He is following Uriel, but he's just following Uriel. He's not following Uriel to victory. And Uriel's idea of victory is not trucking with the demons. And that's basically it. I think that's the whole plan. Because it's easy to be convinced. It's so easy to be convinced. They know your greatest fears, and because of that, they can know your greatest pleasures. Uriel wants to be redeemed. Well, Pausanias wants to be redeemed. I don't know what Uriel wants. A blast of superheated air whooshed behind the stumps of the Merlins, hurling Han Sao from his feet and vaporizing the top half of one of his iron warriors. He rolled to one side as the smoking legs collapsed behind him, and leapt to his feet, leaning over the ragged remains of the fortress wall, and waving his mighty toothed axe. "Come on, Berosus! You'll need to do better than that!" he shouted. Far below, the metallic coughs of massed artillery echoed from the dark mountains, shelling the lower bastions of Calhan Gol to oblivion. The screams of dying men drifted up towards him, but Han Sao paid them no mind. They were but slaves, and those too badly injured for skinning in the flesh camps. And there were plenty more of them to expend. He wiped dust from his armor, and more iron warriors marched forward to plug the gap with a stray shot that had been blasted in the upper levels of his fortress. It had been a lucky impact, and Han Sao felt a thrill of adrenaline course through his body at the near miss. Ever since the siege on Hydra Cordatus, he had carved the fire and thunder of battle. He had craved the fire and thunder of battle once more. The fighting on Purgatory II, upon his return to the Eye of Terror, had been desultory and unsatisfying. The warriors of the Despoiler proving no match for his advanced forces. But now, his fellow warsmiths were attacking him, and this was sure to be a battle worthy of the name. Once again he was forced to prove his mettle to those who once thought him no better than the imperial dogs they had fought the long war against. The bile rose in his throat at the thought that even though his predecessor had named him warsmith, he was still not considered their equal. "Lord Berosus is thorough in his attentions," said Obak Sakeo, his grating, static-laced voice snapping Han Sao from his bitter reverie. "The lower bastions will be nothing but dust and bones soon." Han Sao turned to face his lieutenant, a huge, wide-shouldered iron warrior with yellow and black chevrons. Hissing pipes wheezed from every joint, leaking stinking black fluids, and venting puffs of steam with every step. Like Han Sao, he carried a fearsome war axe, but he also wielded a crackling energy whip. "If Berosus thinks he's achieved anything by killing such chaff, then he is stupider than I believed," sneered Han Sao. His former master had gifted him a mechanical arm after his own had been hewn away from his body by the late Castellan of Hydra Cordatus. It had once belonged to Cortish, a mighty champion of ancient days, and had been a physical indicator of his master's favor. "What he lacks for in imagination, he makes up for with determination," said Han Sao's personal champion, a tall, slender warrior in power armor so dark. "What he lacks in imagination, he makes up for with determination," says Han Sao's personal champion, a dark, slender warrior in power armor, so dark and non-reflective that he moved like liquid shadow. His voice was a ghostly monotone, his face a crawling mass of bioorganic circuitry that ran like mercurial fire beneath his dead skin, and made his eyes shine with a lifeless silver gleam. "Berosus is irrelevant, Onyx. He'll shell the lower bastions of rubble and not be able to move his artillery up. No. It is Tormamino. No, it is Tormino that we should be careful," replied Han Sao, turning from the battlements as fresh explosions and the roars of charging warriors ripped from below. "Agreed," said Onyx, long bronze talons unsheathing from the grey flesh of his hands. "Do you wish me to destroy him?" Han Sao had seen some of the hideous things in this galaxy, having perpetrated a great many of them himself. But even he was unsettled by the malefic presence of Onyx. The Iron Warrior, if he could even still be called such, was a shunned figure, the demonic presence within him making him outcast even amongst his own Iron Warriors. Though his human side still held sway in the symbiotic relationship with the demonic combination, its diabolical presence was unmistakable. "No," said Hansau. "Not yet, anyway. I'm going to break these vermin against my walls first. I can defeat Berosus easily, but I want Tormino. I want him to see this half-breed beat him, to know that the Warsmith was right to choose me as his successor. Then you can kill him. As you wish," said Onyx, a barely perceptible haze of power surrounding him. When the creature had bound itself to Hansau's service as a master of golden coal, it had spoken its name as a sign of fealty, but the pronunciation was far beyond Hansau, so he had settled for the closest approximation of the part he had been able to understand. Onyx. Hansau had seen first just how lethal Onyx could be when the warp-spawned part of him rose to the surface, and he unleashed the full terror of his inner demon. Onyx was his dark shadow, his protector, and he could think of no better creature to be his champion and bodyguard. "Berosus is proud, though," said Obok Sakeo, "and not to be underestimated. He has great strength and many warriors in his command." "Let them come," said Hansau. "They already do," pointed Obek Sakeo, gesturing over the edge of the wall. Hansau followed Sakeo's pointing gauntlet and grinned with feral anticipation. Tens of thousands of soldiers swarmed across the smoking, cratered hell of the lower bastions, screaming like beasts as they slaughtered the few mangled survivors of the shelling. Their victims begged for mercy, but the attackers had none to give, and the carnage was truly on a grand scale. Banners with the devotional heraldry of Berosus were raised high, and sacred standards that proclaimed the glory of chaos and its most raw visceral aspect were planted in the bloody soil. Within minutes, disemboweling racks were set up, and the soldiers who were still alive were ritually butchered before the walls to taunt those who watched from above. "So like Berosus," scoffed Hansau, shaking his head and watching as another 100 screaming soldiers had their entrails dragged from their bellies and looped around rotating drum mechanisms. "What?" asked Sakeo. "He doesn't even have the wit to allow some of his prisoners to live, to show his honorable mercy." "I fought with Lord Forex at the side of Lord Berosus before, and I know there is no such quality left within him." "You know that, and I know that, Sakeo. But if Berosus had any sins, he'd try to convince the soldiers of Kalon Gold that he does." "Why?" "Because if our soldiers could be made to believe that Berosus would be merciful, the thought of surrender might enter their heads." To breach a fortress, you need to break the men inside, not the walls. And to break a besieging army, you must wear its warriors down to the point where they would rather turn their guns upon themselves than take another step forward. We must take every one of Berosus' soldiers and make them feel he is living beneath the muzzle of one of our cannons, that he is nothing more than meat for these guns. Sakeo nodded in understanding and said, "We can do that. My guns will sow the ground before the walls with their shredded flesh, and the rocks will flow with waterfalls of their blood." "To the warp with that, Sakeo, so long as they die," snarled Hansau, pleased to see the ember of fear smoldering within Sakeo flare once more. "Or else you'll be down there with the scum next time. Ever since you lost those slaves bound for my forges, the damn renegades, your promises have been worthless." I will not fail you again, my lord, promised Zakeo. No, you won't! Just remember that Forks is no longer your master. I am. And I know that you are a true protege of his. He may have become so jaded that he tolerated your lack of vision, but do not think for 1 second that I will. Suitably chastised, Zakeo returned his gaze to the slaughter below. What will Berosus do now that he thinks he has the lower bastions? He asked. He will send the demon engines, said Hansau. As though on cue, the monstrous silhouettes of scores of hulking spider-legged war engines and clanking dreadnoughts could be seen advancing through the pillars of smoke and blazing wreckage. Berosus' demonic war engines stalked to the ruined bastions, forcing their way through the fields of corpses, and began clambering across the rocks towards the battered slope of the next level of readouts. Just as you predicted he would, said Onyx, watching the approach of the demonic machines. Hansau nodded, listening as the undulating shrieks of the terrifying war engines echoed towards the next level of defenses. Hundreds of the clawed and snapping monsters hurling their spiked bulk towards the defenders above them. The next rampart was some 500 meters below. Many levels below, where Hansau and his lieutenants watched. But the engines would not take long to reach the defenders. They poured their fire into the climbing machines, but nothing would stop them. The artillery fire from below resumed, and a thunderous crescendo from the first volley exploded against the rock between the defenders and the climbing demon engines. Boulders the size of tanks tumbled down the sloping rock face, smashing a number of dreadnoughts to flatten hunks of metal as the bombardment continued, their gunners shifting their aim as they found range. "No?" asked Obak Sakeo. Hansau shook his head. "No! Let the dreadnoughts get closer first!" Obak Sakeo nodded, watching as the spire-like demon engines reached the next level, their massive clawed pincers snatching up soldiers and ripping them apart. They howled as they killed, reveling in the slaughter and hurling the corpses from the battlements. "Now!" Obak Sakeo nodded and spoke a single word into his power armor's Vox unit. Hansau watched with relish as the ground of the bastions below shook and trembled, as though an earth tremor had struck. Huge gaping cracks ripped across the bastions, splitting the rock with a hollow boom that rivaled the thunder of the guns. Smoke and flames blasted from the cracks, and the ground beneath the entire front half of the bastion sagged and splintered. With a groaning creak, millions of tons of rock exploded and attached from the side of Kalangol, sliding ponderously down the surface of the mountain. Thousands of Kalangol soldiers were carried away, screaming to their deaths, the avalanche of rubble and debris smashing every one of the demonic engines from the mountainside, crushing them beneath the unstoppable tide of rock. Hundreds were buried beneath the mountain, their shrieking roars billowing from the rumble, as their mystical bindings were smashed asunder and the demons within were shorn from their iron vessels. Hansau laughed as he watched the dreadnoughts and the thousands of enemy soldiers below turn to flee the avalanche, knowing that they were already doomed. The tide of rock swept over them, pouring down the slopes they had fought and bled to capture, the rumble of grinding rock slowly fading, as did the bellowing roar of the guns. Berosus, realizing their fire would be wasted without an escalade. Hansau turned from the mass destruction he had unleashed. Now Berosus would know he had a fight on his hands. Hansau's plight, basically the reason he is an Iron Warrior, but he was created with who are the yellow guys? The other yellow guys. Like the ones they really hate. The Sons of Dorn, Dorn's men. Who are the Sons of Dorn? Okay, well those guys. He had Gene Seed from the Sons of Dorn, and so they all hate him because Gene Seed is at a it's really just at it's not something you can just make. It's a finite resource, and you need it to create. It's basically, I think what it does is it regulates all of the extra organs that a person has. I have thought my entire life about the implantation process, and I have recently just been like, I don't know if you can see that or not. I've been cut open, and they added things to me, and it's hellish because in the beginning, your body doesn't really accept it as part of it. It hurt worse than breaking the arm almost. It felt like my arm was in an iron vise, but now it is a part of me, and I am stronger for it. But I'm just trying to relate with you. It was breaking the arm wasn't as bad as the excruciating pain of the surgery. So yeah, that thing was implanted inside of him, and even though he made it through all of the trials, he's still not good enough because they consider him a half breed. And that's basically what their claim is he's not even an Iron Warrior. He's he's someone that's not even an Iron Warrior on a throne in Medjugorje who doesn't deserve to be there. The reason they do this is they're more than happy. They're not like the Space Marines where they want the guy to be indoctrinated and they want him to fucking worship the Emperor. Like that part's almost more important than him killing. The Chaos Space Marines are more than happy than to just have gene bullies. But you could have just mutants, but they're not as good as Space Marines. The unchanging sky and static made it impossible to discern the passage of time throughout their surroundings, and the internal chronometer on Uriel's visor had only displayed a constant fluctuating readout that he eventually disabled. Days surely must have passed, but how many was a mystery. He had heard that time flowed differently in the Eye of Terror, and had supposed he would not have been surprised at such affronts to the laws of nature. "Emperor, I hate this place," said Pausanias, picking up his way over a piece of twisted iron. "There is not one natural thing here." "No." No, agreed Uriel, tired and hungry, despite his armor's best affronts at filtering and recycling his body's excretions into drinkable water and nutrient pastes. "It is a wasteland of death. Nothing could live here." "I think something lives out here," said Pausanias, glancing at the darkened peaks all around them. "I'm just not sure what, or that I even want to find out." "What are you talking about?" "Haven't you felt it? That we're being watched? Followed?" "No," said Uriel, ashamed that his instinct for danger appeared to have deserted him. "Have you seen anything?" Pausanias shook his head. "Nothing for sure, no. But I keep thinking I can see. I don't know, something." "Something? What kind of something?" "I'm not sure. It's like a whisper in the corner of my mind's eye. Something that vanishes as soon as I try to look at it. Something red." "It is this place," said Uriel. "The lair of the enemy will attempt to mislead and betray your senses. We must be strong in our faith and resist its evil magics. Pausanias shook his head. No, it is something not of the enemy, but something that lives here. I think it's that what killed those people in the cave. Whatever killed and skinned those people was evil, and an enemy of all living things. Let them come, whatever they are. They will only find death. Death. The besieged fortress was lost to sight for now. The path from the tunnels leading them down into the rocky gullies and crevices of the mountains. The white sky beat down upon them, harsher than the fiercest sun, and Uriel deliberately kept his eyes averted. Once, he thought he caught a glimpse of the red things Pausanias claimed were following them, but they defied his every attempt to see them properly. Eventually he gave up, unable to catch the sight of them, and concentrated on simply putting one foot in front of the other. The harsh metallic shale of the mountainside grated beneath his boots, and every now and then they saw grilled vents piercing that rock that disgorged a hot steam that tasted of beaten metal. The vents plunged down in the mountain, the darkness impenetrable, even to a space marine's enhanced eyesight. Uriel saw billowing smokestacks, hundreds of meters above them, thousands of blocky chimneys, lining the ridge with great pylons that spewed corrosive plumes into the atmosphere. No matter how much black waste was released in the air, the dead sky was always above them, blank and oppressive. Over the tops of the mountains before them, Uriel could see what looked like bloated dirigibles floating ahead in the mountains. Long cables drooped from their bellies, but whether these were simply anchoring them to the ground or acting as some sort of barrage balloon, Uriel could not tell. Perhaps they were designed to keep the delirium specters at bay from some facility as yet unseen? As their weary trudge through the reeking air of the mountains continued, the two space marines passed the shorn quarry of shattered stone, where the side of one of these cyclonean smokestacks was exposed. Reddish-brown stains spilled from the joints between the massive curved blocks making up the stack, and a monstrous heat radiated from stonework in pulsing waves. "Where do you think it goes?" said Uriel. "I don't know. Perhaps there's some manufactory down in the mountains." Uriel nodded, wondering what diabolical production line was at work beneath their very feet. Were men and women dying even now to forge weapons, armor, and material for the dread legions of chaos? It galled him to think he could do nothing to prevent such abomination. But what choice did they have? The sacred task of the death oath, was placed upon them by Marneus Calgar, and this took precedence over all their concerns. The demonic womb creatures, the Demonculaba, were in the besieged fortress that they had seen as they climbed in the darkness of the tunnels beneath the mountains, and nothing would stand in Uriel's way of reaching that damned place. Pressing on, Uriel and Pausanias climbed a jagged sawtooth ridge, its sides sheer and corrugated, as though gouged by some gargantuan dozer blade. A blackened depression of splintered stone and iron, thousands of meters in diameter, fell away from them on the other side. Crags of iron columns and twisting girders protruding from the mountain clawed like fingers. The depression appeared to be perfectly circular, though it was difficult to tell. Whipping particles of sand and iron filings, filling the air and lashing round the circular valley, and spiteful, howling vortices. A narrow silver of white sky was just visible on the far side of the depression, but all Uriel's attention was fixed on the sight that filled the center of the depression. "In the name of the Emperor!" breathed Uriel in disgust. A huge, grilled platform filled the center of the depression. Layers of dust coated its every surface, and its perforated floor dripped and clogged with jelly-like runnels of fat and viscera. Tall poles jutted from the platform, held in place by quivering steel guys that sang as the unnatural wind whistled through them. Hooked between the poles were billowing sails of flesh, stretched across the timber frames, that the scouring, wind-borne particles might strip them of leavings of their former owners. Monstrous, debased figures in vulcanized rubber masks with rounded eye sockets and ribbed piping running up tanks carried on their backpacks scraped at the stretched skins along with pole arms. They lurched across the platform with a twisted, mutated gait and gurgled monotone commands to one another. "What are they doing?" said Pausanias, horrified at the sight before him. "It looks like they're curing the hides, scraping them clean." "But the hides of what?" said Pausanias. "They can't be human, they're too large." "I don't care what they are," snarled Pausanias, setting off down the treacherous slope towards the platform and drawing his gold-hilted sword. "This ends now." Pausanias set off after Uriel, unlimbering his flamer and checking its fuel load. If the mutant creatures were aware of them, they gave no sign, the howling wind and rumble of the distant artillery making the sounds of their approach inaudible. But whatever they lacked for in awareness, they made up for in diligence, dragging their bladed pole arms up and down the length of the billowing sails, to clear them of whatever the lashing winds left behind. Uriel saw a carven set of stone stairs leading to the platform, and took two at a time as his anger began to build. The first of the mutants died with a strangled screech on the point of Uriel's sword. The second fell without a sound as Uriel hacked its head from his body with one blow. Now aware of the killers in their midst, the remainder scattered in terror. A sheet of flame incinerated more of the mutants, their screams undulating as the rubber bodysuits melted their corrupted flesh. The slaughter was over in a matter of moments. The twisted mutants, no match for the power and fury of the Adeptus Astartes. Most turned to flee, but there was nowhere to hide from Uriel's wrath. As the last mutant creature fell beneath his blade, Uriel took a deep breath, taking profound pleasure in the butchery of such worthless wretches. Whatever deviant beasts they had been in life, they were only so much dead flesh now. He turned as Pausanias said, "Uriel, look!" and pointed at the nearest of the skins. Uriel felt his skin tighten in his chest as he saw the dead features of a man atop the huge expanse of skin, stretched almost beyond recognition, but a man's nonetheless. "Holy blood! How could a man become so vast?" said Pausanias. Uriel shook his head. "Not by any natural means." "But why?" "The ways of the enemy are unknown. Better that remains so." "What shall we do?" Uriel turned in a circle, seeing how row upon row of faces in the skin circling that platform, dead, slack features of men and women, staring down at him as though he were subject in an animus theater. "Burn it! Burn it all!" Like I said, and this is really the only foreshadowing I'll be giving. Space Marines are rare, so even having one of them is a supreme power. Having 1 million of them is a supreme power, but how do you get there, right? That's the question. That's the question you woke up this morning asking yourself. That right? That's the burning question. How do you get more Space Marines?